but I we like to talk about where this all comes from, you know, partly because you should know where it all comes from, but also because I think several of the little pieces of my story are actually good for rabbis to hear. So, although I will not begin to tell you the story, it is a fact that my parents, at least my mother, set up a home more Jewish than the one she grew up in. And I think that that's much more common experience, and many more people open to that, and it's repeated itself in the next 2 generations of our family. I have children, I'm leaping ahead for a minute, but I have children who belong to 4 synagogues, modern Orthodox, conservative, Reconstructionist, and Reform. And there's stories in all of those.
Awesome.
So the earliest influence was my mother, and that's relevant because, first of all, it's an obvious influence, but she was conscious about learning more Judaism. She was raised in a Jewish household in which the religion was assimilation. And social justice, not really, but and philanthropy. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, had a huge influence on me, was the first executive director of Federation in New York. So my mother ended up in a job, this is a little pitch to gender issues. My mother did a master's and an all but doctorate in philosophy when that was not common. This is the end of the 1930s. Had to support my dad, who was in accounting school, got a job teaching philosophy at the brand new opening Queens College division of City University of New York, and was called in August by the head of the philosophy department and said, "We're so glad that we processed your application and we were looking forward to having you teach, but we found a man." My mother did not, this is really important, my mother did not tell that story to her 2 daughters until 20 years ago. Because she thought it was too strong a reminder of sexism. Anyway, the job she got, and here, like, who are the JTS people? But I know there's several of you. Okay, so this is a true story. We were raised on it. We thought it was apocryphal, but it's actually in the history of the seminary. Chancellor Louis Finkelstein, who was asked to come run the seminary, said after, and make it a real enterprise, said after a few years, or a year or 2 of exploring, okay, I have the best rabbis and professors to teach a new generation of rabbis. But it turns out if you run an educational institution in America, you need a press department, you need a community relations department, you need a personnel department. None of my rabbis or professors know anything about that, and I have no money. So the solution is that I will hire the daughters of my donors and supporters because they are women, really smart, and they will come work for almost nothing.
Nice.
And they were called Finky's Girls by Cyrus Adler at the funeral of one of them after my mother died. I went into a funeral of one of them and I sat there and added up that these 9 women gave 400 years of service to the conservative movement. So my mother was the director of public relations, radio, and television at JTS for 55 years. She was Finkelstein's speechwriter and letter writer. She brought her work home in the best possible way, so we were fully exposed to all of this. I lost my point there, but because she was in the process herself of actually learning Judaism in a deeper way, first of all, you can't have a better teacher than Louis Finkelstein. Second of all, at his suggestion, my parents joined Park Avenue Synagogue. Unfortunately, Milton Steinberg died like a decade after they joined. But I would say that my mother practiced social justice Judaism. I mean, she was interested in everything she was learning from Finkelstein, but what she was getting him to do was figure out how to take the Jewish message to the rest of the world. So, none of you are old enough, but my mother was the co-producer of The Eternal Light, which was the single best radio and television program ever done by any faith community. And it is to the unbelievable genius, God knows why, of the head of NBC radio and television in that era that this show was on. If you ask those of you who grew up Jewish, ask your parents or grandparents. There's a whole generation of people about my age who remember being told to run home from Sunday school so they could listen to The Eternal Light. So I can talk to all of you about that later, but the point I think really here is that my mother was learning this stuff, combining her own instinct for care for the other with what she was learning and what she was doing on Dr. Finkelstein's behalf. And so that was really the essence of my Judaism. somebody yesterday made the same grammar correction that I did at some point when you were writing on the, Suzanne, you said less of something, and we both said fewer at the same time. My mother made me, I think she had I thought I was being helpful to her. I think she understood that she was teaching me, but my mother made me proofread every single letter and speech that she wrote with her. So I learned a lot of Judaism and an unbelievable amount of grammar, which irritates. When I met Robert, he said, if you correct me once more, we're going to end our relationship. Anyway, so I would say that was a really powerful origin and beginning. I am the first bat mitzvah from Park Avenue Synagogue because my mother went and fought on Steinberg, with Rabbi Steinberg on our behalf. And I would note in the way in which generations repeat themselves, my granddaughter was the first full bat mitzvah at Ohev Shalom, which is a modern Orthodox synagogue in Washington. Wow. So it's a nice round connection. And then I would say that just to sort of, I think the other big thing, which I'm not going to have to talk about because I'll let you go on with your questions, and you can't control this with anybody, but what was next most powerful for me was living outside of New York. It's not worth telling the story, but I ended up living for 2 years in rural Western Oklahoma. Oh. It might as well have been going to the Peace Corps, which I was a year or two too young to go to the Peace Corps. So I was in a place where there were no Jews, where anybody who knew anything about Judaism knew something that was fundamentally anti-Semitic, not true, and anti-Semitic. And I was 35 miles from the closest temple, and it was just my opportunity to figure out who I was in a way that I think more of us and our children and grandchildren should have that opportunity instead of just doing what's being done. So I learned a huge amount about being Jewish. I have endless Oklahoma stories, but I would say that was the place that strengthened all of my Jewish and Jewishly derived commitments to social justice. And I then took that into, very briefly, community organizing and social change on the West Side. I have a master's degree in social work. I took it into electoral politics, and then I had this incredible good fortune, and I really mean that, of being found by and finding AJWS when it was about this big. And I had just lost an election.
You left us at a great turning point, Ruth. Thank you for bringing your mother and Oklahoma into this. Will you talk us through the introduction between Ruth Messenger and AWS and what that?
Yeah, it was ridiculous. AJWS has a great history. It has a great history, but it has a history like every Jewish organization that has a history then immediately founded on difference and division, right? So it was founded by two people, Larry Phillips, who was the CEO of Phillips Van Heusen Shirt Company, from a fascinatingly complicated American, Jewish, New York, highly successful family. Lots of stories there. And a man named Larry Simon, whom some of you may know, who is still a professor at Brandeis teaching essentially international development. Larry Simon was on the staff of Oxfam. Larry Phillips was on the board of Oxfam. I spent the last 18 and a half years listening to each of them tell me that he's the one who really started it. I actually think Larry Simon probably really started it with Larry Phillips' money. But it was very small, and it had done extraordinary work. I would say that they were sort of almost entirely not in the spirit that we were teaching everybody yesterday. It was not race-based. It was like, oh, all these needy people, and there are all of these faith-based organizations that aren't Jewish, that are all Christian, that are going to help people. And we care about the other and the stranger. That was certainly the thread pull through. So we'll start a Jewish organization doing that. But it was focused on goods and services. It was focused on disaster relief. As Sam will tell you many times, and it did really good work. It didn't have, on the part of its founding board, it didn't have any kind of sophisticated notion about all what we were talking about yesterday. What does making change really mean in the developing world? And the good news is it gradually, even as a small organization, hired a couple of staff people who had that vision. One of them was a graduate of SACE, Johns Hopkins School of International Studies. One of whom just came to this through her own work on Russia and Ukraine, but basically they were the people. The staff was tiny. When I got here, there were 13 staff people, and I fired one of them. So I asked the young woman, what she could tell me what she did, and she couldn't tell me. In 30 minutes, she couldn't tell me what she did. So I said, I think we don't need you. Anyway, it was a great bunch of people wonderful. And I want to give lots of credit by name to Catherine Shimon, who was the director of program services and virtually everything else early on. But she brought into this work her sense of how do you make change in the world. And so I really learned my first lessons about that. And I believe I had learned, as I told you yesterday, many of them in the city of New York. That's really where I learned to listen to people who were different than me and pay lots of attention to what they were doing. I learned it in Oklahoma, and then I learned it in politics in New York City. Anyway, I love local politics. Just love it. Anybody who's here tomorrow night and wants to come meet a phenomenal woman running again to win the congressional seat in Southern Illinois, I'm posting it at my house. You can come for free. But I love politics. I do a lot of dabbling in politics. I decided after 20 years in New York City government to run for mayor in what was not likely to be successful. I'm happy to say that I'm now being interviewed by every press person in the world, including the Washington Post, because I ran against Rudy Giuliani. They all want to know what makes him tick. So I'm having this wonderful spate of interviews in which everybody in the press, it's just interesting what the press does, assumes basically that he was a really good guy and a really good mayor and really on a great personal trajectory, and then something went loose. So I actually believe, that something did go loose. I mean, I watch him on television, but the fact that this guy was a totally self-centered, totally mean human being was there even when he was doing a phenomenal job of reforming the police department in New York City. He was a really, really strange personal character, and it's just now all over the world. Ukraine and whatever. Anyway,
get back to interview.
So I lost that person, and I did this job. And I have a friend who had run a foundation in New York, and she was one of the many people who was helping me look for work. And her husband did work in with the Jewish community in Russia and Ukraine, and he happened to do it as out of the AJWS office would be the easiest way to say it. And so he told her AJWS has lost its director. It had 2 directors before that, and they're looking for somebody new, and she suggested that they get in touch with me. And my biggest concern when I applied for the job was that I had been doing politics, and therefore Jewish politics, in New York for 20 years, and I'd never heard of the organization. But they interviewed me. They were desperate to find a CEO. They had gone through a search process with DRG and ended up with 2 candidates, and the few remaining members of the board were split in half on the 2 candidates. So they reopened the search, and quite seriously, they hired me, A, because they were desperate, and B, because I was infamous, but I had a name, having been in politics and run for mayor, and they thought that it couldn't hurt. So that's how I got it. And then I learned everything.
That was my next question. Tell us a bit about the transition from local politics to all that is AWS. One could say all politics is local, but the world of AWS is
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think at the bottom line, it really is all the same. I mean, I told the story itself that I picked yesterday. I told you because that's where I learned to listen to people, and it was just a dramatic new opportunity. My world was literally bounded by the Hudson River on the west and the Atlantic Ocean on the east. That was it. So all of a sudden it was like, okay, here's a chance to look at international stuff and learn from the staff and come to realize that everybody, at that point, a small number of organizations, but wherever we were working with an organization, it had a natural leader, often indigenous, sometimes an American who had moved there, who was committed to making social change, who was taking risks, basically any one of them more substantial than risks that I had taken in most of my political life, and often more substantial than risks that the groups I worked with in New York were taking. Since the one thing about risks inside the city of New York, they only occasionally put you at risk of death. And AWS has grassroots leaders all over the world who are at risk of death. So it was just a great opportunity to think about those things and reapply them and have an opportunity. And then the big thing, which is why I talked a lot about my mother, was I struggled a little bit when I was elected official with Judaism, and I didn't struggle with my Judaism personally, but I struggled with when to talk about it. And when there is a famous interview in which was being besieged by a young reporter with a Jewish last name who kept saying to me, kept asking me questions about, he had my whole voting history. Well, why did you do this? Well, why did you do that? Why did you do that when you knew you were going to lose? And so finally I just looked at him and said, like, I don't get, like, keep asking the same questions. And he said, I'm trying to understand why you're a 60s activist in the 80s when you're going to lose every one of those issues. And I said, given his last name, well, because I'm Jewish. And he looked at me as if I had told him that it was because I was made of green cheese. So that was sort of a piece of despair that I think I then tried to figure out how to deal with in government, and that made me really happy about coming to AJWS because I had endless audiences at that point. I just had to go find them, synagogues around the country, but places to say this is quintessentially Jewish work. For those of you who remember New York City history and politics, I want to say about Ed Koch, whom I fought every day on substantive issues, that I thought Ed Koch did a perfect job of saying, like, I'm Jewish, I come from Jewish poverty, I come from Jewish values, and this is what I'm trying to be about. We didn't agree as to how to express it in reality, but it was for me a really great model, now carried out by some Jews, many people of color, many LGBTI people saying, like, this is a piece of who I am and I'm going to explain it to the world, and I'm not only not shy about it, I'm proud of it. So I felt like I learned some of that from Ed Koch. Ed Koch, K-O-C-H, character and a half.
Ruth, you opened the door for us perfectly. A question my team gets frequently is, what is Jewish about AWS? And I love hearing your vantage point on it.
Everything. I mean, for me, it's like, it's just a question of talking to other people about it, but it's obviously, as rabbis, we can find a sermon in anything, in any parsha, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, I think the core of what Judaism is all about is, in fact, being there for the other and the stranger. When I talk to audiences, I emphasize, which you talked about or mentioned a little bit yesterday, the true notion of the Tel Elohim, which was part of this story of self, but really just meeting these leaders in other countries that we've been privileged to help, and just listening and saying, like, okay, these people are indeed equally, if not better, made in the image of what it is, ever it is that made all of us. They know themselves, they know their strengths. And when we talk about helping the other and the stranger, we have to start with the premise that means helping them realize their own visions of justice. And I'm quite critical on a constant basis of government foreign aid and of many many seemingly good initiatives in the American Jewish community that don't actually respect the other. And that's true in domestic work for sure, and it's true in, and I didn't mention, I talked about JTS, but I was at JTS when Heschel was there. So I was like the first poster child for take your daughter to work, since my mother took me to work whenever there was a school holiday, because she was very serious about her work. So I basically got loved, cared for, and questioned by a small universe of really famous JTS rabbis and professors. Anybody remember Seymour Siegel? Seymour Siegel took me to Williamsburg for Purim. Said to my mother, "You can't come, but I'm taking her." So I remember. So I had those. So Heschel was a really powerful figure in my life. And for me, then coming to AJWS, whatever the challenges of being a CEO, which were immense, but it was like, okay, here's a chance to be Jewish, express your Jewish values, and what nobody had really thought about before I came, because they were so small, but was like to go any place in the country and say, this is quintessentially Jewish work. So I mentioned the Tel Elohim, and I think how powerfully that fits with the rights-based approach to development. I take really seriously, I know it's a trite expression, tzedek tirdof, but I take it really seriously to talk about the notion of pursuit. And this is not something that's going to exist. It's not something that's going to be created. It's something that we're going to constantly be pursuing. And there is a rabbinic, which you probably often say, whatever, I can't cite it, but teaching that says that one rabbi said that it says tzedek twice, because it has to be not only the end but the means. And I think that really describes the work of AWS, is we don't go and tell people, now you will be just, now you will be equal, now you will end poverty, with like, what is the best way of our doing this is to have full and maximum respect for you as a person you are. And not to challenge your immense years of learning, which I keep learning from rabbis and educators at JTS, and which I've just actually put into a curriculum. But I think about half the teaching that makes it clear to me what's Jewish about it. AWS is in curriculum. Just very powerful maxims for the nature of the work that we do. Oh, and then Gordon mentioned, thank you, on the phone call the other day. But because of how I was raised, I take really seriously this notion of obligation. And there was a point in the middle of my time here when I was doing a lot of campus work and being invited to Hillel's. And I actually came up with a line for its laugh benefit. But I would say that I would tell people that I was going to talk on campuses about the Jewish obligations in global social justice. And people would tell me, I used to say this to students, that you can't use the word with obligation with students in the 21st century. And I would say, okay, I'm going to find an alternative. The alternative is obligation. So I just don't think there's another way of talking about it. They don't have to accept it, but it's not a drop in if you feel like it. And not to be ahead or behind or whatever, but recognizing with full respect how much of this you have to do. So I'm not critiquing that you do it, but I hate B'nai Mitzvah projects and mitzvah days. I just think that we are full of an American Jewish community that thinks they did it. They did it on Martin Luther King Day. They did it when they were on the Bima. I once met a rabbi who said, if one more child stands up and tells me about collecting soccer balls for 4 children in East Jerusalem, I'm going to vomit. I thought that was like dramatic. But so that's a whole piece, I would say. Go ahead, keep going.
Just a few more questions, and I promise we'll open it up because I have ample time for all of you. I both hate and love the type of question to pull out a single most, but I'm going to go there, Ruth. And I want to ask for really one of the most challenging moments you had as CEO and president of AWS.
Okay, so you told me you were going to ask me that. And I really wanted to say, and this is directly corollary to many of your jobs as head of an organization or a congregation, but the challenge and the weight, I guess is the word that I would use, that comes with the combination of fundraising, hiring and managing the staff, and dealing with growth. And in the case of AWS, very lucky, was dealing with growth, but dealing with growth or change or looking at, those are really, I tell people I have 7 part-time jobs in the Jewish community now, but I don't have to raise $40 million every year, and so I'm young. It's just, I think the challenge of raising money, figuring out how to do it, it's a huge issue. But since we're really talking a little more seriously, I want to say that I would say in many ways, my biggest challenge with American Jewish World Service was dealing with what I coined for the progressive social justice Jewish organizations, of which there are many. I said that our challenge was the OJC. OJC stands for the Organized Jewish Community.
Yes.
And it's gotten a little better in the last 22 years. I think the Roundtable does phenomenal work. I think there are many more recognitions of the Mazones, Hazoms, Jewish World Watch. We could talk about all of them. But I think that the slowness of the federations and some of the denominations and the powerhouse organizations in the Jewish community to understand social justice as an essential element of Judaism for the last several thousand years. That's the religious, theological, metaphysical, or to see social justice as a portal for engaging young Jews is just astounding. I just think that they are constantly sort of blind to it, missing the point. I work at the JCC of Manhattan, and we did last year for Martin Luther King Day, and I can send it to anybody. It's about an 8 or 10 page. It's called The Torah According to Martin Luther King. And it's basically Martin Luther King's 1967 speech, which I was there for, at Riverside Church, and counterposed with Jewish text. Looks more or less, not completely beautifully, but more or less like a page of Talmud. And we used it for the service day that the JCC ran, and we offered it to, now I'm telling tales, but that's okay. We offered it to New York Federation, which sponsors every Jewish organization that has anything to do with, to do an MLK Day of service. And we said, would really be good if you could figure out a way to help do this. I'll do a webinar teaching people how to use it, but it's a way of saying it's not just service, it's also advocacy and social change. And they liked it, and they got back to us and said, is it okay if we reduce it to 1 page? And I actually said no. I almost never said no. But I said, look, you can put out anything you want. If you want to do a different design of this, if you want to give me back a different way in which it should be laid out, that's fine. But no, I work with a bunch of rabbis and educators. It's 8 pages. Nobody has to use more than 1 paragraph of it, but don't give it out as 1 page. This tells you everything you need to know. So we're still in that battle.
Wow. Speaking of condensing an incredible amount of information, you mentioned this CEO succession paper yesterday. I read it. I highly recommend it. I know most of you in some way have been involved in succession, or let's just say transitions in your career. So I wanted to know if there's anything you want to add to this or something you want our host away from.
Well, that's a much longer story, which we can do over dinner or we can do in Guatemala. But as I said yesterday, I love this because I suggested, because the suggestion is a challenge, I suggested to the foundations that they fund this, that they do it. And they found 5 other organizations, so there's 6 stories. And what I like most about ours is that we all told the truth. And so you will see I do not look wonderful in every page of those 20 pages. And I think the underlying issue, which is literally, as I say, an 8-hour conversation, but is what is the purpose of boards of directors? What power do they have? What power should they have? How does a CEO or a rabbi relate to her or his board? I think these are fundamental questions for the entire not-for-profit community, way outside of the Jewish community. In the Jewish community, I think there is a dramatic tendency, which I understand and which AJWS is guilty of, but to have some people on your board because of the size of their contribution. And those are people that you need in order to survive, and they're not always people who understand roles and boundaries and limitations. So the essence of this was that I had a board naturally that wanted to do a national search because they had a great organization, and I wanted them not to do a national search and to hire Robert, and we actually ended up where I was. But it was a, and I didn't bang it well.
Incredibly transparent and learning, but endured. Thank you. Tomorrow we'll be joined by 2 of Gordon's colleagues from Hartman, Rabbi Justice Baird and Naomi Adlins. I don't want to take any thunder from the incredible discussion we'll have, and you have a summary of the white paper in your binders. But the topic of prophetic leadership is one I've heard you speak a lot of. So can you add a little bit about what it's like to live our values in a complicated day and age?
Yeah, I don't think I can do it better than Victor did it yesterday. So thank you. That's the issue for all of us all the time. Everybody knows how to be a leader. You all hold positions, which I need to remind you regularly, because being at home at work, you probably don't remember it every day, but in which you are imbued with a huge amount of respect. Doesn't feel that way. But having a rabbi really matters to people, and by the way, it matters more to virtually anybody outside of your congregation than anybody in your congregation. But if you remember what Robert said on the webinar when he greeted you, is that I will tell you several times how big your congregations are. That's because Jews regularly, and rabbis too, are like, okay, I'm the rabbi of a small startup that's trying to do whatever and whatever. And I'm like, no, you're talking to the American ambassador to Guatemala. You are all rabbis of large synagogues in major cities in the United States. They don't know, and they don't need to know. There's a piece of power that you want to convey. So, look, half of them don't know what Jews stand for, and half of them, I will say that, I know you won't believe this till you get there, but a significant majority of non-Jewish members of Congress think that, know they have Jews in their district, think in some way that Jews are powerful, and think that the only thing that Jews are interested in from Congress is the AIPAC position on the Middle East. And if you want to leave it that way, then you shouldn't be in this room. We spent a year, some of you will remember, Gordon will remember, about 6 years ago, lobbying to change the United States Farm Bill, FARM, which has to do with how food aid is provided by the United States around the world. And every congressional office that I called, introduced myself and the name of the organization, said, I have a group of rabbis who want to come talk to the congressperson about the Farm Bill, said, okay, we'll have our Israel foreign aid person here. That's why I started spelling farm. No, it's not foreign, it's farm.
Oh my God.
You're rabbis, you want to come talk about farm? I said, yes, and your congressperson's on the agriculture committee or the appropriations committee. That's why we singled you out. Well, what do Jews have to do with it? Anyway, it just was a lesson. I sat with a congressperson once early on in my tenure for AJWS who said, when we started, I'm happy to meet with you. I do everything that the Jews want. And it turned out that he meant that he was lobbied once a year by AIPAC. He was a not Jewish congressperson of color from a state and a district with not a large number of Jews. And that's who he saw. That's his connection to the kippah and to Rabbi was AIPAC. And AIPAC has built a phenomenal congressional lobbying system. And by the way, going back to what I said before about the size of your congregations, any member of Congress, including Jewish members of Congress, thinks AIPAC is infinitely larger than it is. And that's to their credit.
Last question, then I want to open it up. We are going to inundate
Okay, go ahead.
clergy with so much information over the next 6 months in these days and over webinars, and we go to Guatemala and then in Washington, D.C. If you wanted to boil all of this learning down to some key themes that you want them to hold fast to, what might that be?
Sure. One is the one we talked about yesterday, for which I'm totally indebted to Brian Stevenson. This is notion of proximacy. What does that really mean? What does it mean to get next to the people? By the way, it's true in your congregation. I spoke to one of your colleagues this morning. You would know Alan Cook. He's the Reform rabbi in Southern Illinois. My 99-year-old aunt is going strong in Southern Illinois. She's never talked about Judaism. She's now a little obsessed with death, not surprisingly. And I was just telling him how to go and talk to her. It's like, just get there. She's totally healthy. She's like a firecracker. But I was like, please do not go and say, I'm your rabbi. Would you like me to do your funeral? I didn't say that to him. But I just said, just go and chat with her. Ask her about, he gave us some clues. It's like, but just get close to her. You'll see what an amazing person she is. And I was telling him, she's then likely to ask you some question about life or death that she circled around with me for the last 8 hours when I was there, but she wasn't going to ask me. So proximacy, you get an experience. It is why I said this yesterday. It is why the whole Global Justice Fellowship program is structured around not only meeting grantee partners, but meeting several. Because what we need you to do is fall in love with these people, which that's easy. And then just take a half step up so you start to understand what's common about people who step forward in their own communities as indigenous or grassroots leaders. So that would be the first one, is the importance of proximacy. The second one we also started to talk about yesterday, and that is how change gets made. We're trying to figure out how to measure and evaluate all the work that we do, but we are really clear in this organization that change does not get made by the Western countries, USAID, or even by totally progressive leaders of some of these countries, without really getting into the question of how do you change people's behaviors, how do you change people's beliefs. It's a process. If it could be done easily and quickly, and if we can make the world unpoor from the work we do in Geneva and Washington and London and the US, then it would happen. And instead, as you see, and we ought to talk about this a lot, but there's pretty clear evidence that a lot of this is shifting backward in the way that we don't want. Gordon and I talked about this a little bit yesterday. I would love for us to talk in spare moments about the differences between patriotism, nationalism, and nativism. I think that is the trajectory that we're on. And the third one, so how change gets made, and since I made the nasty crack about mitzvah days, whatever, I just want to say that the biggest thing that you can all help us do, whether it's local or global, is to help people in your communities and congregations understand the difference between and the connections between service and advocacy. You will hear that a lot when you meet with our Washington team today, but we supporting 487 grassroots groups making social change in 19 countries, but we know that those issues have to be taken to the halls of Congress, and in many cases with those groups have to be taken to the halls of power in their own countries, because it doesn't only happen from the bottom up. It also happens with commitments to systemic and structural change. And so those people who do service, and so I would say it very specifically, my current issues, substantive thematic issues, which I work on in all these other jobs I have, are land rights, which I feel like AJWS was really a leader in. So land and water rights, race and racism, particularly in the United States and in New York City, and immigration. And on immigration, I would just say that literally I'm in places where people call me and say, my congregation wants a family. And I understand the instinct, and I want those families to be resettled, and I want them to be loved, and I want them to be helped to learn English and learn that we don't have a healthcare system in this country and whatever. But all these congregations that are taking their furniture and setting up apartments for the one Syrian family that they found, somebody, i.e. their rabbi, has to talk to them about immigration laws and immigration history. The story of Jews in this country is like the least well-told issue right now. Every single person in this room is a child or a grandchild of immigrants. Your congregations are full of people. Your congregations, I want to say, are full of people under 25 who have no idea the immigrant story of their family, none whatsoever. Please raise this. You'll be lucky if they say, I think my grandfather was Romanian or came from Argentina. But what the story is, what happened in Argentina, how Jews got to Argentina, they don't know it. Their parents aren't teaching them this, their schools aren't teaching them this. And then they want to tell you that those immigrants are taking their jobs. So I feel like this is just a powerful set of connections. Anyway, the third one, which I think I've already been branded with, but is moral courage. Moral courage is for everyone in this room. I really, Victor, I just treasure that story. And it's just like nothing better than learning from what you didn't do. It involves risk-taking. I don't want any of you to lose your jobs, but we are counting on all of you figuring out your own best ways with us to take risks, to raise issues, and to be able to do a constantly better job, which I challenge myself on all the time, of speaking truth to power and trying to make change. Okay.
Just 5 minutes.
Is evangelicals wear a button or a bracelet that says, what would Jesus do? WWJD. So this is what would Heschel do.
Oh.
I have some people like that.
Definitely.
I promise time for questions from everyone else who would like to start with. Go ahead, you, Suzanne, and then.
I have maybe a piercing question. In order to have grantees and to have partners in all these incredible sacred tasks, you need fundraising, as you mentioned. Is all money kosher?
No, good question. Wow.
Yeah. So among my many current jobs, the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York has set up a women entrepreneurship program. They have 10 women who are doing social change in Israel, in America, and in Africa. We selected them, and I'm their facilitator for a year. This is their biggest question. The first question is, how do you raise money? Who do you raise money from? But the next one is all money kosher? So I am, if there's a spectrum, I am pretty far left of center on this. The shorthand is their money is, I mean, I'll modify this in a minute, but the shorthand is their money is green and I can make better use of it than I can. Now that's complicated. If they've been convicted of a crime, I don't want their money. But you know, one of our biggest donors, I know how her husband made his money. She describes her role in the world as giving away his money. But I know how he made his money. It's not illegal, but it's not particularly politically attractive. It was basically, I don't want to out them, but it was basically advancing what I would call super conservative policies around the world. There are lots of people who've made money in unattractive ways, and I just think you need a screen. By the way, this is a much more of an issue. And I came into AJWS with a lot of experience in this, because this is a huge issue for elected officials, for candidates, where you could just destroy a campaign taking money from somebody who's, when I was an elected official on the west side of Manhattan, I took money from Donald Trump, and I said to my constituents, there's no quid pro quo. He's got the money. I know what he wants me to do. Everyone knows what he wants me to do, and I'm not doing any of it. So you can pick at me if you want, but I need his money to run for office, and he knows I'm not going to do what he wants. So we can tell it's Donald Trump stories, Rudy stories. But I mean, I would just say there was a couple of times where AJWS returned people's money. And there was once a story where a donor sent us $50,000 in response to a disaster, which was an astounding amount of money at that time, some world disaster. And we looked it up, and the nicest word for him would say that he was a slumlord in California. And I am not King Solomon, and you might all disagree with me, but I made a decision, which is we'll take this money and we will never lobby him. And for years afterwards, because they have a great development department, so somebody would walk in and say, there's this donor in California who once gave us $50,000 and we've never been to see him. Could we go now? And I was like, no, I don't want to talk to him. And I wouldn't go into his office, but he sent $50,000 for victims of something, and yeah, we can use it. So, but I think it's a complicated question. And as you know, the texts say that in order to start a town, you need to raise money, you need 2 people to raise money and 3 people to give it away. So the whole question of like, it's an issue on which you should have other people that you consult with that you trust, because any of us can be too easily co-opted. So it's like, this is somebody's money I should take or not, and should I send any limits on it? Really great question.
Suzanne, we'll come around the table, so I'm gonna get that side next. Suzanne.
So you said you took risks when you were in politics, and then you realized that the people that received the money from AJWS are taking even greater risks. I'm wondering if that led you to take more risks than you had before. Can you give us an example?
I would say both to take more risks, Suzanne, and people ask often, like, how do I maintain my optimism and my determination and my vision? And it's like, you meet 5 or 6 of these leaders. And, you know, Joe told the story yesterday of the trans activists in the DR who said to us in January of 2017, like, why are you asking what you can do for us? The question is what we can do for you. Yeah. We know what it's like to have a lunatic fascist running the country. And I mean, that came as a big shock to us, but I'm just saying, like, it's seeing people who step forward, who have risked death. We have lost several leaders, land rights activists and LGBT activists who have been murdered. And in most cases, or at least the people that I knew, they knew they were risking their lives. You might meet Claudia Samayoa, who is not someone we work with anymore, but is a Guatemalan activist. And she risked her life so badly that we actually sent an amazing organization to advise her on the risks she was running. And she actually was told to leave Guatemala for 3 months because she was likely to be shot. So, I mean, that just changes my whole orientation to basically thinking in the best of ways. I think every day I can't possibly measure up to these people. But yeah, so it inspired me to take, also in politics, I would say I took some risks. You're always being in politics, you're always being second guessed by everybody who works for you, telling you not to stick your neck out. When people ask me what's the next, I'm deviating for a minute, what's the next step for this country? I think it's really clear. We need 3 Republican senators to become people of moral courage. I don't care if it's faith-based or not, although I'm talking to people at JTS, URJ, and Union Theological Seminary saying, like, maybe you could do a press conference and call on some of these people. But if there are 3 senators who, whether it's impeachment, it doesn't matter what the vote is. You know, the one example of this we have in the last year is John McCain, and the good news is he did it, and the bad news is he was about to die. And it shouldn't take being about to die to vote against what your constituency thinks it wants. So I used it in politics, and I would say since then I basically feel like I run fewer risks because I'm not running an organization and I'm not in politics. But yes, I would say that I take risks in deciding what to do and what not to do and how far to push it. I was talking to some people about this yesterday. I have a wonderful universe of jobs at AJWS, at JTS, at the JCC, with Meldon schools. I'm going to show you all my curriculum later. But it's different to be in a position in which you're not the boss. You're an elected official, despite everybody who thinks they can tell you what to do every minute of the time. You are actually the only one out there. And as CEO, you are out there. And so for me, it's like, okay, this is actually fun. I can go into JTS and just keep pushing an issue that people don't want to hear about because I'm taking really a minimal risk. They would fire me from my advisor job so much. And I'm very proud to say this was not quite this big an effort, but I'm happy to say, and then to invite you if you're going to be in New York on Thursday. But Arnie Eisen, who is the chancellor of JTS, is on the highest trip to the border, which is a big thing, I think, for JTS. He's reporting to the community on Thursday at 1 o'clock. So just see me if you want to know about it. And JTS will, in the next week or so, declare itself a sanctuary.
Oh, whoa.
Which, by the way, there's not a human being who will use JTS as a sanctuary, in my best judgment. We can only do it easily under federal law because we have a synagogue on the premises. But the notion of coming into this building, this massive building, in order to find the sanctuary, I think I'll go into a neighborhood church first. But the symbolism of saying this is a sanctuary building and saying to the conservative movement, this is what JTS has done is, I think, really
Did you
important.
push them to do that?
I worked for Stephanie Rusquet. Here's my best story. You should all live so long as to have this happen. When I came to AJWS in 1998, I started on September 1st, and the high holidays, my rabbi, who was then Julie Schoenfeld, said to me, Blanche, a member of our congregation, Blanche's granddaughter needs a job. Could you advise her? So I met with Blanche's granddaughter. It took me an hour. I hired her as my executive assistant, and now I work for her. So Stephanie Rusquet subsequently went to the clinical school. She is the originator of the college service trips here. She is the originator of the rabbinic student service trips that we ran for a while. She then worked at Avodah and for Join, and she's now the assistant dean of the rabbinical school at Associate Dean of the Rabbinical School at JTS, and the new executive director of the Handel Center for Ethics and Justice. And I work for her. So I would say it was a quiet cabal conspiracy. But we moved that issue.
Mazel tov.
What do you do about frustration and anger?
This is a previous level question, but I said after the tailspin that we've all been in since 2016, despair is not a strategy. And we can't, and what I had said previous to that is we can't retreat to the convenience of being overwhelmed. And I always want to amend that in a serious discussion to say that doesn't mean I never feel overwhelmed, and it means I don't feel despair. It's just like those are not strategies. And similarly, frustration and anger are not strategies. Anger, probably more than any of the others, is a strategy. If you harness your anger and figure out a way to try to move the issue that we were talking about, what I showed Elise, given what you said yesterday, is a major ad in the New York Times, article in the New York Times, first section today, saying, talking about a new effort to get voters across lines of difference to talk to each other. And so that whole issue level of like turning it into concrete structured way. Sometimes when I get angry, I just get angry, and I really try not to kick either my children or my grandchildren or the dog. I don't have a dog. But it's, but I think you have to have, I guess the quickest thing I would say is you have to have outlets for it. I'm here talking about social justice. I'm a passionate cook. I'm a bike rider. I'm a downhill skier, which is bad for the environment. And I have a wonderful family. So you need lots of outlets. That's really, but it's not like you can't have these emotions. So it's like, it's sort of the Musar stuff that Lauren was talking about this morning, to acknowledge how you feel and figure out what to do with it. So I do want to say I'm going to pass this around later, but I had the incredible privilege of being asked by Melton Schools, which I think is an amazing organization I didn't know very much about, to do their curriculum in social justice. And it was a hilarious conversation because I said to the guys, the head of Melton Schools, no, I mean, seriously, this is all a hoax. I know 100 words of Hebrew and 47 great quotes, and all the rest of it is from my education staff. So they should be writing it. And he said, yeah, but I don't know who they are, so will you do it? So I hired Lisa Exler. God bless Lisa Exler. And so Lisa Exler and I have now just finished, and I will pass it around. I think it is an extraordinary curriculum. And I want to say working with Mountain Schools was a real privilege. They're very serious about what they put out. They're very serious about text attention and editing and user-friendly systems. And I will pass it around, and any of you who are interested in being able to use it in your congregation or community, let me know, because Melton is currently, in honor of this curriculum, coming up with a new approach to people using this who don't want to use other Melton products.
And for one last question, Josh.
What do you make of what? I mean, maybe I just noticed it, but what seems to me in the last 10 years or so to be a real concerted effort to divorce social justice from Judaism. There have been a number of articles written about it. There are a lot of people out there who are trying to say that these two things actually don't have a natural place together.
Well, that was like one of my, there's a good example of moral courage. When shortly after I got here, when I was preaching this gospel, that social justice is an integral part of Judaism, there was some Jewish conference, I can't remember if it was the Funders Network, probably it was Jewish Funders Network, and they had a panel on this about, I think the panel was called, "Is it Jewish to Save the Whales?" or something like that. And they wouldn't put me on the panel. They did put somebody from the pro side, but they didn't put me on the panel. And the other side was separating it out and saying this is Judaism light, this is not what Judaism is all about. Was Jack Wertheimer, who's a distinguished professor at the seminary where I now work. And he stood up to denounce all this. And I went to the person who was running the program and said, okay, you wouldn't put me on the program, but I want to ask the first question. And I said to him, Professor Wertheimer, have you read our AJWS curriculum for people who do service? And he said, no. And I said, okay, then shut up. You have no idea what connections we're making. There's nothing light about this. And it draws from text that you believe in and teach all the time. So I think your put down is misplaced. And you might have some people who are doing things that say they're Jewish that you think are not, or that you think are Judaism light, but don't insult what you don't know. So I just think it's important to keep talking about it. I think it is a complicated issue for all of you. We had a session or two on this. So the question is politics in the pulpit. But it's very sad to me that many rabbis, for reasons that I entirely understand, Josh, in terms of angry congregants, your contract, your board, retreat from making pretty obvious parsha to contemporary time connections, whereas we actually have this Torah that over and over again speaks to magnificently the political issues and political questions. So, to quote Arnie Eisen, since he's now one of my bosses, you can argue about how to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. You can't actually argue about whether or not we're supposed to do it. And so the question is how do you go about it? And we may have to agree to disagree, but after all, that is entirely what all of our texts do. Jews lived and survived for 6,000 years because we wrote down every disagreement, and on who's on which side. So I think it's, and with all due respect, the lead rabbi who wrote The Politics Does Not Belong in the Pulpit, who was a distinguished rabbi by the privilege of traveling with him and seeing our work in the field. But the first call I got was from activist members of his congregation who basically said, okay, we've read what he wrote, but for the entire last year, he discussed the Iran deal every single Shabbat in synagogue. So it's not a question of politics, doesn't belong in the pulpit. He had politics. He has a Persian Jewish congregation, and he discussed his opposition to the Iran deal every week for 8 months. So, it just, don't be too hard on him, but he doesn't actually, if you push him, really mean what he says.
He does. He just means a particular kind of politics.
Yes, right, okay. But then that's it. That's not politics, doesn't belong in the pulpit. So I know we're done, right? So I just wanted to mention, we will talk at some point informally and in Guatemala about a couple of issues that are on my mind. I'm just going to alert you to it. One is the huge gender problem and gender division and split in the Jewish community, in the role of women in the rabbinate, in the role of women as organizational CEOs, and in the problems of harassment and abuse. This is an undiscussed, not sufficiently discussed issue, and I hope we will spend some time talking about it. We will, and Joe has nicely put some in writing, but we will look for what I consider to be key examples of moral courage. I want to just mention one of you who came up at an exchange I had with David. So one of my many, many, many unsung Jewish heroes and examples of moral courage, whom I commend to all of you, and if I remember, I'll send you his quote, but it's Cyril Harris, not known rabbi. Cyril Harris was a Scotsman who was an Orthodox rabbi in England, and the British powers that be in the Jewish community sent him to be the chief rabbi of South Africa in the last few years of apartheid. Mandela called him his rabbi. I was privileged to meet this man. He took risks that I think are just extraordinary, defining what Judaism is all about, supporting Mandela, and his most powerful quote, just to give you an example of, I don't have it word for word here, but was at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is South Africa's greatest contribution to the ends of genocide, had not been practiced in most other countries. But at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Harris testified and said, basically, Jews didn't create or cause apartheid, and only some Jews actually supported it. But every person in this Jewish community has profited from it. I mean, that's the kind of risk. The South African Jewish Board of Deputies just went berserk. They had, fortunately, no power to take away his job. But I just think being willing to sort of call that out, it's what we talked about yesterday. It's being willing to say you were wrong, or something was wrong. And you have to do that to move on. And the reason I did the land rights acknowledgement yesterday is we all live and work and are trying to work for social justice and social change in a country that has not acknowledged its genocide of the Native American populations and has not come to grips with race and racism in our communities or with the issues of reparations. And that's a very shaky platform for us to stand on to try to make social change. Books, I just want to do this. If you want to you just want to read a great book about racism, it's a novel, you can read it in 2 hours. Colson Whitehead, who wrote The Underground Railroad, has a new book called The Nickel Boys, and I recommend it to everybody. Ta-Nehisi Coates' newest book, which is a novel called The Water Dancer, is the most beautiful description of slavery and the slave trade and the abolition movement as a novel. And a fantastic book by, this is now on immigration, a man named Jason DeParle, who wrote a book called, I'll give you the name exactly later, but it's In Order to Provide, You Have to Leave. It's the story of immigration in the 21st century, and it's painful. And then if you really, really, really want to be upset, and I'm just, the last thing is Netflix has a program called Living Undocumented. I can't watch more than one episode at a time, and I can't watch it without a member of my family in the room. We are the most disgusting country in terms of treating immigrants. Which the best story is there's a Mexican woman who we have deported, who came here illegally, married a man, an American, who had served 3 terms in the Marines. We just deported her and one of her daughters. She chose to take her younger daughter because she couldn't leave her alone. But we split up the family. So I just think this is worth, it's, Elise, it's not to get depressed. It's not to get.
I was just told that I'm not allowed to watch it. Not this month anyway.
No, this is, I would say this, somebody told me to watch it, and I watched television late at night. I watched 2 episodes late at night, and I didn't watch it for the next morning. I'm watching these again, and I'm only watching them when you're in the room. I mean, I thought I was going to break the television.
Can I recommend one book?
I'm going to bike wreck that because we're going to collect all the resources and come back. We want to make sure we get all of those and wait to share it. So we're definitely going to come back and bring all the resources. Ruth, we never stop learning with you, and we'll continue.
And I'm happy to tell